Good morning. Welcome to the Department of Psychiatry Grand Rounds today on this lovely spring day. I'm Kaz Nelson, Vice Chair for Education, and it's my pleasure and honor to be introducing Dr. Melvina Bissonette, who's been a psychiatry resident in our program, and she's finishing up her 4th year and graduating shortly, and we're very pleased about that. Dr. Bissonette graduated her undergraduate degree at the University of New Mexico, where she studied psychology, went on to the University of Minnesota Medical School for her MD before joining our psychiatry residency. She has a diverse patient panel currently, and her next steps will be in providing care to American Indian communities. And so she brings a unique perspective, and just from her personal work in this area and from the care she's provided to really comment in an expert way on this really interesting topic. And so she's agreed to save a little bit of time afterwards for discussion too, so we can all engage. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bissonette. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Everyone can hear me? Okay. All right. Maybe it's Derek, you should go to the back. I'm just kidding. All right. So during speaking engagements or introductions, it's not uncommon for American Indians to introduce themselves by tribal affiliation and indicate where they are from. So in keeping with that tradition, I am Melvina Bissonette. I'm Oglala Sioux on my father's side and Dene or Navajo on my mother's side. And I grew up in New Mexico on the Navajo Reservation. So why this topic? Before I entered medical school, I made it my mission to serve American Indians. While in medical school, I realized the best and most fulfilling way for me to do this was by providing mental health care. As some may know, I have a service obligation to work in an IHS hospital or clinic or setting in which the patient population is largely American Indian. This past year, I was interviewing for psychiatry positions in these settings, and I was asked multiple times about historical trauma and if I understood the impact it has on the community. It has largely been accepted by the American Indian community that historical trauma has a large role in many of these disparities experienced by American Indians today. I had heard of the concept of historical trauma before, but was not fully clear about its meaning or the implications of its effects on a community. While I was educating myself, I thought this would also be a wonderful topic to discuss for a Grand Rounds presentation. So here's an outline for today's presentation. First, I'll define what a historical trauma is, the ideology behind colonization, then I'll give some examples of traumatic events. There are many examples of historical traumas in the American Indian narrative, but I will spend some time focusing on the boarding school era. This will be followed by discussing Maria Yellow Brave Horse's work on the role of unresolved grief and the trauma response. Next, the skills developed by Whitbeck in relation to historical trauma, followed by an overview of traumatic experiences in the present day, and I'll close with a brief summary. So disclosures, I will not discuss off-label or investigational drug use of any drugs in this presentation. I have had no relevant financial relationships in the past 12 months. So the learning objectives of this presentation are increase awareness of the concept of historical trauma, identify symptoms that may be related to historical trauma, increase understanding of how historical trauma may impact a patient's present-day mental health. I also want to add that before I begin this talk, there are 565 federally recognized American Indian tribes and many other unrecognized tribes in the United States. Each tribe has their own distinct name, language, history, and cultural practices. There is no homogeneous American Indian group, and I do not claim to be an expert on American Indians, even though I identify as American Indian myself. Okay, so what is a historical trauma? The term is most conceptualized as a collective complex trauma inflicted on a group of people who share a specific identity or affiliation, either but not limited by ethnicity, nationality, and religion. There are 3 distinguishing characteristics of historical trauma that have been identified. They are generally widespread among communities. At the time of the event, many people in the community experienced or were affected by the event. The event generates high levels of collective distress and mourning in contemporary communities. As we will see later, Braveheart started to work on documenting the distress experienced by contemporary American Indian communities with her work on unresolved grief and the trauma response. Whitbeck developed skills to measure the level of distress caused by this. The events are usually perpetrated by outsiders with purposeful and often destructive intent. This has been identified as being critical to the definition of a historical trauma. So historical traumas often lead to identify losses such as land, native languages, traditions, spiritual and religious practices, and family and community structure. These have been deemed historical losses, which I'll talk about later. So to understand the attitudes and philosophies used to justify the destruction of American Indian culture and people, one must have an awareness of the concepts prevalent in the British and religious societies of that time. These include, but are not limited to, the doctrine of discovery, which papal bulls of the 15th century gave Christian explorers the right to claim lands they discovered and lay claim to those lands for Christian monarchs. Any land that was not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited. If the pagan inhabitants could be converted, they might be spared. If not, they could be enslaved or killed. And also the big concept of manifest destiny, the 19th century doctrine or belief that the expansion of the U.S. throughout the American continents was both justified and inevitable. At the heart of manifest destiny was the pervasive belief in American culture and racial superiority. Native Americans had long been perceived as inferior, and efforts to civilize them had been widespread. So I'm pretty sure somewhere along time, many have probably heard this saying, like, kill the Indian, save the man. So if we can't kill them, then let's civilize them. So American people were forced to assimilate. It was not a choice. The primary path for assimilation was removing children from their families and placing them in boarding schools. The boarding school era is one of the more well-known periods of time in American history relating to American Indian people. It is also one of the most traumatic epics of American Indian experience. We will discuss this in a little more detail in a moment, but first I want to go over a few more notable events in the history of American Indian people. So, historical traumas. I thought it would be important to provide a brief history of events that have been indicated in the literature as meeting the criteria for historical trauma experienced by American Indians. So it's estimated that as many as 100 million American Indians inhabited America, and the population of American Indians is estimated to have decreased by 95% from the time Columbus came to America in 1492 to the establishment of the United States in 1776. There are two main factors that can explain the decline: intentional killing and exposure to European diseases brought to America, such as smallpox, diphtheria, measles, and cholera. Some of the exposure to these illnesses was unintentional, but there were cases in which exposure was intentional. It is well documented that in 1763, Lord Jeffrey Amherst ordered the introduction of smallpox to American Indians through blankets given to them. Also, enslavement. American Indians were sent to other countries as slaves. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson approved the Indian Removal Act, forcing the relocation of as many as 100,000 American Indians. By 1876, the U.S. government had obtained the majority of American Indian land, and American Indians were forced to either live on reservations or relocate to urban areas. These relocations led to the deaths of thousands of American Indians and disruption of families. In 1871, the U.S. Congress declared American Indians wards of the U.S. government. The U.S. government's goal became to civilize American Indians and assimilate them to the dominant white culture. This became the start of the boarding school era, which I will talk about more in a bit. And in 1883, federal law was passed that prohibited American Indians from practicing traditional ceremonies. Mourning practices were disrupted, and American Indians were not able to properly mourn their losses. Losses that the dominant culture failed to acknowledge. In 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted, which lifted the federal law passed in 1883. So not too long ago. So throughout the majority of history by the U.S. government, the intent was not to take only American Indian land, but also to force the American Indian people to fully assimilate to the dominant European culture and completely abandon their own culture. As mentioned previously, in 1871, the U.S. Congress declared American Indians the ward of the U.S. government. The goal was to civilize American government. The goal was to civilize American Indians and assimilate them to the dominant white culture. The federal government began sending American Indians off to off-reservation boarding schools in 1870. Pictured here is U.S. Army officer Richard Pratt, who founded the first of these schools, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, in 1879. This school was modeled after an American Indian prisoner assimilation experiment that Pratt oversaw. He described his philosophy in a speech he gave in 1892, which I wrote down kind of like the brief summary of it. that came down to this: kill the Indian in him and save the man. So in this picture here is a group of American Indian students at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Attendance was at first voluntary, but due to this not working as planned, attendance became forced, often through threats of cessation of rations and supplies and incarceration. Children would be taken from their families at the age of 4 or 5 and were not allowed any contact with their relatives for a minimum of 8 years. The intent was to annihilate the culture of American Indians by stripping their children of all connections to the past. In the schools, the children had their hair cut and were dressed like European American children. All sacred items were taken from them. They were forbidden to speak their native tongue or practice traditional rituals or religions. Not being able to engage in traditional ways and religious practices led to the loss of ethnic identity. Many American Indian children were also abused physically and sexually. The removal of American Indian children from their families and placement in boarding schools is considered one of the most devastating traumas. It resulted in the disruption of family structure, forced assimilation, and was a disruption to the American Indian community. This has also been identified as a precursor to the development of very problematic coping strategies like learned helplessness, manipulative tendencies, denial, scapegoating, gambling, alcohol and drug use, and suicide in many of the American Indian children who attended boarding schools and many Americans in the community, or American Indians in the community. In 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act was passed, which allowed government agencies to enter into contracts and make grants directly to federally recognized Indian tribes. What this meant was that tribes could now decide how to use these funds, which in turn gave them greater control over their welfare. This act is what helped bring an end to the era of forced removal of Indian children from their homes. It now became a personal choice to attend a boarding school. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was also passed in response to the alarmingly high number of Indian children being removed from their homes by public and private agencies. It's a federal law that seeks to protect the best interests of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families by keeping American Indian children with American Indian families. The memories of a childhood spent in a boarding school for many American Indians are still raw and painful to bear. From personal experience, I have met elders who will not talk about this experience, some of them being my own grandparents. So the concept of American Indian historical trauma was developed in the 1980s and 1990s to explain the impact of one generation's trauma on subsequent generations. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, pictured here, a PhD in clinical social work, suggested that the current social pathology and disparities among contemporary American Indians were a product of unresolved grief and accompanying self-destructive behaviors passed from generation to generation as a result of the numerous traumatic events experienced by American Indian communities over generations that led to the loss of lives, land, and culture. So I've highlighted a couple of things about the research she did. She looked at Fogelman's studies of Jewish Holocaust survivors and their descendants. Braveheart saw similar experiences among Jewish Holocaust survivors outlined by Fogelman and those of American Indians: difficulty in mourning a mass grave, dynamics of collective grief, and importance of community memorialization living among the perpetrators. A specific example she used to compare was the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, in which it is estimated that anywhere from 150 to 300 men, women, and children of the Lakota were killed, many unarmed, and their bodies disposed of in a mass grave. In terms of Niederlander and Kestenberg's work, she looked at survivor syndrome and survivor's child complex. So what she saw there was descendants of Holocaust survivors were noted to be more likely to experience symptoms of anxiety, depression, impulsivity, and intrusive Holocaust imagery, including nightmares, withdrawal, isolation, guilt, mistrust, unresolved grief, denial, psychic numbing, survivor's guilt, and elevated mortality rates from suicide and other forms of violent death. Children of survivors were also noted to have more difficulty expressing emotions and regulating aggression. They felt guilty and had an increased tendency towards self-criticism. Stress vulnerability to the future events were noted to be significantly more likely than the controls to develop PTSD or subthreshold PTSD symptoms. Doka's work on disenfranchised grief also contributed to the formation of the historical trauma concept. This is when a loss cannot be openly mourned. This is when a loss cannot be openly acknowledged or publicly mourned. What can at times feel disenfranchised grief is only recognized and considering grief legitimate only when the relationship to the deceased has an immediate kinship tie. So characteristics of the grievers can also impact this. For example, when a person or group of people are socially defined as being incapable of grief, there is little recognition of their sense of loss, need to mourn, or their ability to do so. American Indians have historically been viewed as stoic and savage, thus viewing them as being incapable of having feelings, thus lacking capacity to experience grief. Disenfranchised grief can result in an intensification of normative emotional reactions like anger, guilt, sadness, and helplessness. She also cited Kaufman's work and the experience of unsanctioned grief as being influential. This introduced the concept that historical unresolved grief can be passed on for generations. So Braveheart suggested that disenfranchised grief facilitates historical unresolved grief among subsequent generations of American Indians. She likened this to the children of Jewish Holocaust survivors who experienced a pervasive sense of pain from what had happened to their ancestors and an incomplete ability to mourn those losses. Descendants of Holocaust survivors were noted to be more likely to experience obsessive ruminations about the deceased. They used coping strategies such as fantasy about projecting oneself into the past. Some have had pseudo-hallucinatory-like experiences of the traumatic events that occurred in previous generations. They're noted to have withdrawn psychic numbing, experienced anxiety-related disorders, guilt over not living the experience or survivor's guilt. There was noted to be increased substance use and mental illness. A lot indicated experiencing chronic sadness and depression and unresolved grief and mourning. She and other clinicians working with the Lakota noticed that a lot of these symptoms were also exhibited in Lakota children. Oops. What happened? I'll just do this. Okay, so historical losses scale. In 2004, Whitberg and colleagues released their paper titled Conceptualizing and Measuring Historical Trauma Among American Indian People. So they developed the historical loss scale and the historical loss associated symptom scale. First, they asked if we were dealing with an actual historical issue or more of a grief and trauma from daily stressors experienced by an economically disadvantaged people, discrimination, poor health, and high mortality rates. Second, how is this transmitted across generations, as most adult parents of today's children have not been in boarding schools, and they are several generations away from the genocides that took place in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Third, what is the prevalence of historical trauma and grief, and how widespread is it, and does it affect today's parents and children? Last, what are the symptoms? So in order to identify components of historical trauma, they had focus groups with American Indian elders on 2 reservations in the upper Midwest. The elders were aged 55 and older, there were groups of 8, and the focus groups were conducted over 3 sessions. The conversations he had during those sessions were audio taped and transcribed. The goals of the sessions were to identify the kinds of losses associated with historical trauma and to identify the types of emotions these losses elicited from the elders. Items on the historical losses scale that you see here were selected based on the number of times they heard them mentioned in the discussion with the elders. One of the biggest cultural losses identified was the loss of their native language, which was often tied to the forced boarding school experience. Other losses presently thought of were the erosion of traditional family and community, loss of land, and broken treaty promises. There was even a strong sense of loss identified regarding alcohol and drug use. The historical losses associated symptom scale was created based on the distress items mentioned during the focus group discussions with other tribal members, and symptoms identified in earlier studies by Braveheart and colleagues. The intent was to determine the extent to which the respondents would associate emotional distress directly to historical losses. It was felt that if they if they use the standard stress measures of depression, anxiety, and trauma, that they would point to proximal rather than historical causes for these symptoms. So in terms of feelings associated with these losses, anger and depression were the two primarily identified. So my point here is to show the results from these scales administered in brief and not to discuss in detail. So in summary, the scales were administered to American Indian adult parents or caretakers of children aged 10 through 12 years old on 2 reservations in the upper United States and 2 Canadian reserves in Ontario. They received 143 responses, 32 males and 111 females. The respondents are ranged in age from 28 to 59 years, with a mean age of 38.2 for women and 41.7 for men. Of note, respondents were not part of the forced boarding school era, and several generations had passed since the worst atrocities afflicted on American Indians. So from the data collected, one can see that the majority of the current generation of American Indian parents and caretakers on the reservation had at least occasional thoughts regarding historical losses. About 1/5 to almost 1/2 of the people surveyed had these thoughts daily or more. The frequencies of these thoughts indicate that the current generation of American Indian parents is very much in touch with the historical losses of their people. So this one is the historical loss associated symptom scale. So the people surveyed immediately completed the historical loss associated symptom scale. After finishing the historical losses scale, they were asked to refer back to the former questionnaire with the phrase, "Now I would like to ask you about how you feel when you think about these losses." The most frequent emotional responses to thoughts about historical loss were sadness and depression, anger, intrusive thoughts, discomfort around white people, and fearful and distrustful intentions of white people. What Whitbeck and colleagues' study found was that perceptions of historical loss were not confined to the elder generation, but many adults of the current generation thought of these losses. And thoughts about historical losses appear to be associated with symptoms of emotional distress, although severity of these symptoms is yet to be established. Oops, I skipped a slide. Okay. In a study by Weishelt and colleagues, the focus of their investigation, wait, something happened here. Okay, never mind. Okay. The focus of their investigation was to examine the extent of historical losses and associated symptoms reported by an urban American Indian sample living in a large city in the eastern United States. 120 urban American Indian adults, 60 men and 60 women, with a mean age of 42 years, participated in the study. In the urban American Indian sample, it's easy to see that about 1/3 of the respondents reported thinking about historical losses at least weekly. Those who responded having thoughts weekly, daily, and several times a day. The top 5 historical losses respondents reported thinking about were loss of respect by our children and grandchildren for elders, loss of our people through early death, loss of respect by our children for traditional ways, loss of self-respect from poor treatment by government officials, losses from the effects of alcoholism on our people. In regards to the historical loss associated symptoms experienced, sadness, depression, anger, anxiety, nervousness, feeling like avoiding places or people that remind you of these losses, and losses of sleep were the most frequent emotional responses or thoughts of historical losses. So of note, when Weishelt and colleagues compared their scores of both the historical loss and associated symptom scales to the scores recorded by Whitbeck and colleagues, the urban American Indians had higher mean scores. They postulated that American Indians living in urban areas may experience more severe historic trauma symptoms than American Indians living on the reservation due to contributing enculturation factors like cultural identity and cultural connection that reservation communities are more likely to have. So my big takeaway from the 2 previous studies is American Indians who have not directly experienced trauma often feel the effects of generations of trauma. And these effects are not limited only to American Indians who live on reservations, but are also experienced by urban American Indians. Current traumatic experiences, such as the ones listed here, have been indicated to contribute to the experience of unresolved grief and historical loss symptoms. There are some that I want to highlight. So religious defamation, the misappropriation of cultural, spiritual practices. I think it was in the news a couple of years ago that down in Arizona, someone was using sweat lodges and accidentally killed like 3 people. Treaties, for centuries, treaties have defined the relationship between many Native American nations in the United States. More than 375 ratified treaties have helped the U.S. expand its territory and lead to many broken promises made to American Indians. Blood quantum tends to be a big issue, asking a person who identifies as American Indian, how Native are you? What percentage are you? And microaggressions, a term coined in 1970 by a psychiatrist named Chester M. Pierce. Microaggressions are defined as brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to certain individuals because of a group membership. Microaggressions generally happen below the level of awareness of well-intentioned members of the dominant culture. They are different from overt, deliberate acts of bigotry, such as the use of racist epithets, because the people perpetrating microaggressions often intend no offense and are unaware that they are causing harm. So in the community, the majority of American Indians estimate to be about 60% receive their mental health and behavioral and medical services from Indian health hospitals. The IHS was established and funded by the United States government in 1955 to uphold treaty obligations to provide health care services to members of federally recognized tribes. So this means about 40% of American Indians receive their health care in non-IHS settings. The most recent census shows that of 2012, there are 2.9 million people who identify as American Indian or Alaskan Native alone. American Indians rate higher in health disparities than any other racial or ethnic group in the United States. American Indians are at a greater risk of psychological distress. American Indians experience poor overall physical and mental health. There are higher rates of depression, PTSD, and substance abuse. They have the lowest life expectancy compared to other population groups in the United States. Death from alcohol-related causes being 5 times more likely for American Indians than white Americans. Increased suicide rates than the national average. The suicide rate has been indicated to be 50% higher than the national average. American Indians have some of the lowest income levels, highest poverty levels, and least education. Recent data shows that only slightly more than half American Indian high school seniors in Minnesota graduated on time in 2015. So the graduation rate for American Indian students in Minneapolis alone was at 36%. Mistrust is a big concept among many American Indians. Multiple papers have indicated that the level of mistrust many Americans have for healthcare providers and government agencies stemming from a history of maltreatment by healthcare providers enduring broken treaties and promises has contributed to this. Between 1973 and 1976, 3,406 American Indian women were sterilized without their permission in IHS hospital settings. This mistrust has been indicated as a factor preventing many American Indians from seeking health care. Experiences of indifference, disbelief, avoidance, repression, and denial of their community's historical experiences only works on deepening this mistrust. So putting it all together, historical trauma has impacts on 3 levels which are distinct but interrelated. On the individual level, people are more likely to experience symptoms of PTSD, guilt, anxiety, grief, and depression. On the family level, impaired family communication and stress around parenting, the forced boarding school era disrupted many family systems. On the community level, breakdown of traditional culture and values, the loss of traditional rites of passage, high rates of alcoholism, high rates of physical illness, and internalized racism. The intent behind the concepts of historical trauma and historical trauma response was to foster healing by providing a context for the extreme emotional distress found in American Indian communities. So it's been indicated that historical loss thoughts are associated with a range of emotionally distressing symptoms. The literature and findings on American Indian historical trauma suggest that this must be considered when working with American Indians, and it is important to assess American Indian patients on their sense of cultural identity and the degree to which they think about historical losses and experiences associated with those, or experience-associated loss symptoms. And so understanding this could help inform ways of alleviating psychological suffering and unresolved grief and promote healing and resilience. So final thoughts. I think I kind of sped through that. So I thought this closing paragraph by Whitbeck and colleagues was very poignant and encapsulated the concept of historical trauma and its effects very well. I left it here for you to read. I'm not going to read it for you, so I'll give you a second. So the big thing I want to highlight there is that among many American Indian communities, it's felt that these losses still continue today and have not changed. There have been a lot of attempts to try to save the native language and traditions, but a lot of those have been lost with time. And so that's all I have for you. And thank you for your time. My resources.
Thank you, Dr. Bissonette. We have time for some discussion and questions. I wanted to kick things off and see if, just in your personal professional commitments moving forward and in the course of the literature review, are you starting to formulate ideas or approaches for you as you provide service in the community as to how to, this seems like overwhelming, ongoing, progressive, devastating problem. What's your piece in formulating part of the solution in your community?
One of the things I thought of as I was going through the literature is that a lot of these symptoms sound like those experienced by a borderline patient. And so kind of as I was thinking this and I was discussing with some other friends who work with Native Americans closely, is that maybe the core concepts of DBT would be really helpful in addressing some of these symptoms. Because I know a lot of our patients who end up needing DBT often have a historic or have a trauma past, and so going from an individual level, but going to a community level and trying to incorporate those concepts to address the community needs.
That's really interesting, and part of what you discussed too was this idea of acknowledging or validating the historical context, and perhaps in your interviews when people are asking you that, the subtext of that is, are you going to be able to validate for this community the impact of those losses and to not make it just an individual problem, but a system-wide community problem and historical problem as well? That's how you interpreted that question?
Yeah.
Based on...
validating and acknowledging those losses. An example I can think of is earlier, my third year and fourth year, I had a Native American patient, and I was thinking of him too as I went through this presentation, and he came with a huge sense of mistrust. He first grilled me on my Native American heritage. He wanted to know who I am, where I was from, and once I proved to him that I was Native American and understood where he was coming from, and acknowledged some of the things that he experienced, such as some racism, he talked to me about being followed around by security guards and being pulled over for no reason, and kind of acknowledging with him that does happen. I mean, it's happened to me, it's happened to family members, and so that's not isolated to him. That just in acknowledging that, there was a huge shift in his mood, and he didn't feel so alone and isolated.
So use of selective disclosure to build that rapport in this context to acknowledge and validate the context that he was speaking from.
Yes.
Do you feel that other providers of different ethnic backgrounds could be able to do that as well? Obviously not with the same background, but there's a role for that?
Oh, most definitely. I think anyone could acknowledge the suffering of someone without having necessarily experienced it or coming from the ethnic group that experienced that.
Any suggestions for how to do that practically?
Practically. Use your DBT skills. I mean, that's what it kind of, I know I've had I mean, that's what it kind of really comes down to is like, I understand, or not I understand, but I hear what you're saying, and yeah, you know, those losses are significant. No wonder you're like thinking about that, like that had a huge impact on the community.
Other questions or comments?
I definitely have used Melvina as a resource when I've had Native American patients, either when I do like, when I was an intern in pediatrics, I had a Native American family that was very shut down to the primary team, and it was me, and I had Melvina, and it was very helpful to understand why they were so stoic. Like, I didn't understand, so people thought like parents weren't involved, but actually she helped me understand that, you know, that it wasn't that they didn't want to communicate. It was partially probably because mistrust, partially because they didn't understand what was going on, and it wasn't that they were, and there was even thoughts of self-harm of the kid, you know, and it wasn't that situation. It was that their community, this is how they responded, right? And so I think that understanding, I guess, cultural knowledge helps a person like me who's not Native American understand the next, where the viewpoint is coming from. And having a resource that you can go to, I think, is helpful. At least it was for me. And then the other thing I was thinking of is like the rash of suicides that have been happening in different reservations, right? Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or, you know, anything that you came across.
Gosh, my thoughts on the high levels of suicide. I think kind of the big point is there's a lot of maladaptive behavior that has been passed on from generations, probably stemming from these times when people couldn't, you know, when people were being ripped away from their families and they weren't learning those good coping skills. They didn't have family involvement. Reservations, and a long time ago, American Indian communities were a collective. Everyone kind of helped raise a child. But nowadays, it's very isolated. People are kind of on their own, and I think that isolation and probably children not really understanding why they're so stigmatized is probably something that relates to the high suicide rate.
Thanks, Melvina. I think there are so many points that we could spend hours addressing more. A couple of pieces that I found that I wanted to highlight and seek out your thoughts on that reoccurring trauma. And I think that comes from even today with ongoing mining along reservations and pollution of the rivers that come into the reservations themselves, and different tribes that fish and use that water, to alcoholism as a sense of coping. One area that I wanted, though, to ask you is research. Because I know that because of this reoccurrent trauma, mistrust that you talked about, mm-hmm. Anytime sometimes academics try to go into different communities, but the Native American communities, research is viewed very in a questioning manner of mm-hmm. what might the true intent of this research be. If you can comment on any of the information that you read or personal experiences as a medical student, as a resident, and soon to be an attending.
Yeah. So from the Whitbeck study, what they actually did to kind of address some of that was they found Native Americans who were in, I think, the social work field. They educated them on how to run focus groups. The important thing there was that the people who were collecting the data on the American Indians were from that tribe themselves. So I think that helped them develop a sense of rapport with the people they were interviewing, because I completely understand where you're coming from. It would be very hard for an American Indian, especially, I mean, you have this history of people coming on to American Indian lands and kind of taking what they wanted and leaving, so it's understandable, but that American Indians would assume that's what anyone who's not of their community would maybe have intentions of doing. So in terms of addressing that, it's probably helpful to seek out people of their community and use them to gather the data.
A question, and then I'd like to make a comment. You listed that one of the traumatic experiences of present day was romanticization or mm-hmm. eroticization as a response. Could you clarify that? What did
Yeah.
you mean, especially about romanticization?
So, when I was an undergrad, I took this class on human sexuality, and it was long thought of that for a long time, like American Indians were hypersexual, and part of that was because their traditional dressing, I mean, when it was hot, I mean, they were likely to not wear tops, and you have this European American society coming in that's very conservative, and so they misinterpreted that as, you know, Native Americans being hypersexual, or, and then the romanticization continues. I mean, you can easily do Google searches of American Indians, and you see like the scantily clad American Indian woman with a big moon behind her back with a wolf baying at it. I mean, there's images like that everywhere. And a big one too would be like, I don't know, like probably everyone has seen Dances with Wolves, but that whole movie is romanticization of American Indians. I mean, the story is not about the American Indians and the atrocities they faced. It's really about John Dunbar, and the American Indians are just kind of like this romantic symbol in the back that help him find who he is. Yeah, they're basically a prop in that movie. It's not really about what happened to them. It's more about this person discovering who he is.
A comment then. I want to thank you. This is a very important topic, and something that I always feel so ashamed about being American. This whole topic of trauma that you're addressing, I want to alert the audience to a program that the Minnesota Society for Adolescent Psychiatry is sponsoring next September 9th on the whole topic of trauma, psychological trauma in children, adolescents, young adults. That'll be given over at Abbott Northwestern Hospital, and we're going to deal with many topics. And I'm thinking today we should deal with this particular topic of the repeated trauma. The whole issue of repeated trauma is extraordinary. A few months back, we had a topic on moral injury. Again, on moral injury from Dr. Black from Regents. And I'm thinking this is sort of the super classic case of moral injury done to a whole generation or a whole group of people that it seems like that may be irreparable because of the new data that have to do with genetic changes from the social environment. The histones of that kind of are the regulators of whether gene will be expressed or not. It can be altered by what's going on in the environment. The one classic study is the starvation studies of the people from Netherlands in 1944, and what happened to them and their children and their children's children in terms of physical illness and so forth. But here, I think we've got an example of repeated traumatization that I would think would change the very character of Native Americans. And I hate to even think about it as to what that did or what that's doing. In the matter of romanticization, I want to call everybody's attention to what might be a romanticizing, but still is beautiful. Is a poem written about our country here, Minnesota, and the Midwest, and so forth, by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The poem is The Songs of Hiawatha, and it tells about Native American life and the real meaning of it, and its spirituality and its really beauty. The phrase I think most will be familiar with are these lines: "From the shores of Gitche Gumee, by the shining Big Sea water, lived the daughter of Nokomis, daughter of the moon Nokomis." And it goes on to tell about Hiawatha and Minnehaha, all of who are our friends here in Minneapolis, and describing the spiritual and the ways of Native Americans, which I think put us in touch with what we've lost in what we've done to this community.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Klein. Any other comments or questions? Oh, here, then there.
Is there any national coordinated effort among multiple tribes to deal with healthcare and mental health issues in the U.S., where multiple tribes get together, 50, 100, 150, 200 tribes, to work on those issues, or is it mostly local? And then probably related to that is, has the Native American income from gaming and gambling been directed toward healthcare and mental health care at all? In large and significant ways, as sort of a task force approach?
So the answer to the first part, I'm not aware of any like collective tribal group that is trying to address the disparities among American Indians like across the whole United States. My understanding, and I could be wrong, is that a lot of it is done more on the local level and tribal level, that they have yet to develop something that would be national. And on the second part, again, with gaming, I don't think much of the money is directed back towards mental health. A lot of that money, I know, is split up and given to the people who are enrolled in that tribe, and they get a lot of money, like each month or each year. But I'm not too clear on how like tribes allocate all those funds. But I know a lot of the majority goes back to the people, which that in itself has been shown to be very problematic in itself. As a lot of people, I mean, you're giving people who have been impoverished a ton of money, and a lot of them don't know how to spend that or put it aside for future educational expenses. There's also been people who've known that, who go in and target specific people, by trying to get them, to spend their money on drugs, which I think in turn has increased the drug use in these communities.
Hi, I'm from Outpatient Mental Health, Adult Day Treatment, and I just wanted to let you know that we do have some staff that have Native blood in them, and we have worked with many different clients who are Native, and our approach is to validate what they have experienced, mostly suicide, troubles, and PTSD. Sometimes they go further into detail in groups to discuss other things like historical trauma. We stabilize them. Sometimes people can't get into DBT or can't do it right away because DBT has homework and you have to be able to concentrate. Mm-hmm. So we build up their skills to be able to stabilize them and then move them on to it because DBT is pretty demanding. But I've worked with this program for 17 years and done the intakes or the diagnostic assessments, and I ask about ethnicities, and I don't just ask, are you white, or if a person looks Caucasian. I go down the line. Are you African American, Hispanic, Native, Asian? What's in you? Some people will start to say that they're one thing. Some people will say maybe I have a little bit of Native in me on my grandma's side, and then I go into it saying, well, what tribe are you? Mm-hmm. And see how much they know and how much cultural they have connection with that. And it's pretty interesting, and it's also very important in designing treatment for them. But I just wanted you to comment more on like the hidden ethnicity that I've found, people who have Irish names, German names, Swedish names that have Native blood in them. So just because they have like a European name doesn't mean that they're not Native.
Yeah, I think the big thing to find out there is how much they identify as being American Indian. There are a lot of people who probably have some form of Native American ancestry, but yet don't identify with it. And so I think to be of better use to them would be just figuring out how strongly they identify with that part of their heritage.
Any other thoughts or questions? And we'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.